Hi, everyone. I am Elizabeth Porter, and I am a French teacher and curriculum specialist and world languages instructional coach. I live in Richland, Washington, and I'm really excited to present to you today a method that I designed and created called Language with the 5 Senses. So I'm going to share my screen with you. The language with the 5 senses. And I want to talk to you first about what is language. What is it? Language is living. It changes with generations, geographical location, time periods, and individuals. So language is a method of communication with others in order to get our basic needs met. It is how humans interact with each other, right? And it's essential. I mean, I think a lot of people don't really think about what language is exactly. And I had to start with this question when thinking about how I wanted to teach language. And I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of how I created Language with the 5 Senses. So I grew up between France and the United States. And I went to the Université de Caen in Normandy, France, and I studied FLE, Français Langue Étrangère. Shortly after I graduated, I started my first teaching job, teaching English to elementary school students in France. And then I went to a wonderful, amazing program called Cavilam in Vichy. And I was trained there on FLE. And the way in which we taught language in France with FLE was completely different than how language was taught in the United States. It was more of a whole language approach. We did teach grammar, but we did teach through only using French and not using English. And obviously we wouldn't use English, but we didn't use the speaker's native language. And I was fascinated by this method, and I returned to the US and became certified to teach French, but I also became certified to teach English language learners. So I'm TESOL certified. And the way in which we taught TESOL was very much the same way that I learned to teach language in France through the FLE methods. And so I started applying this when I became a high school French teacher. I started applying these methods that I had learned as a TESOL teacher and going through my FLE program at Cavilam. And I was seeing a lot of really great results with my students. Shortly after, I became a curriculum specialist. And curriculum really fascinated me. I loved working with teachers. I found that working with teachers was something that really fulfilled me. And then my son was born, and he was autistic. And I started exploring the way that he was learning language through pictures because he didn't speak. We didn't think he would speak. So he started learning language through pictures, which is called PECS, Picture Exchange Communication System. And I thought to myself, a light bulb went off, and I thought to myself, why don't we teach world languages this way? And so from my background in TESOL, from my background in FLE, I mixed it with how my son was learning language as an autistic child. And there was born Language with the 5 Senses. So this is your brain, and I don't know why this slide is cut off, but along with this, I have done a significant amount of research on how the brain learns, and specifically how the brain acquires language and how that language becomes ingrained and in the kept in the long-term memory. I wrote a book called Pathways to Language Fluency in 2019. It came out, and that book has a lot of my research in it. But basically, you are born with about 100 billion neurons. So your brain cells are called neurons. And when you learn a new skill, something called dendrites grow out of those neurons. And when two dendrites grow close together, it creates a synapse. And messages are sent via neurotransmitters across the synapses. And you can grow exponential amount of dendrites. You can create exponential amount of synapses and neurotransmitters. And your brain never stops growing. In fact, your brain is the only organ in your body that never stops growing. And the reason why it's all wrinkly like that is because every time you learn a new skill and it is reinforced and kept in your brain grows larger. And so your brain, I mean, you have a finite amount of space in your head, right? So the brain has to create a place to grow. And so it grows in on itself and folds in and all of that. And that is called myelination. All learning is sensory. So we learn new skills through our senses. And we have these special sensory receptors in our bodies that send information to the brain. Now, here's the thing about the brain. The brain uses 60% of the body's resources, but it is the only organ in the body that does not make its own resources. So it has to be pretty picky about the information it lets through because it needs to conserve resources. This is why the more of our senses are activated during the learning process, the more likely it is that the information will be passed from what's called our reticular activating system, which is like the gateway to the brain, up into the amygdala. And then what happens is the amygdala decides, is this something that is going to hurt me? Or is this something that is going to help me? And if it is something that's going to help, it sends the information up into the cerebral cortex, which is the upper part of the brain. So your amygdala is the part of your brain that is the reptilian part. It's the oldest part of your brain. And it is the fight or flight. So it is what was developed when you had a man or woman, prehistoric man or woman being chased by a saber-toothed tiger and they had to survive, right? This was like, you better get out of here, you better run. And sometimes our amygdala lies to us, right? And that's what causes anxiety and that's what causes discomfort. And so we have to make things as comfortable as possible for our amygdala in order for it to send the message to the cerebral cortex. So not only does learning through our senses help make the information pass through the reticular activating system into the amygdala and make it more comfortable for the amygdala to send the information to our cerebral cortex, it also creates double the connections, double the dendrites, double everything, and reinforces all of that information and puts it directly into the long-term memory. So language with the five senses education, or language with the five senses, the method came out of this research and this idea and the science behind how our brains naturally are wired to learn, and specifically naturally wired to learn languages. We know that the earlier a person acquires a new language, the more pliable the language center of the brain becomes. So we have two language centers in our brain. We have Broca's area and we have Wernicke's area. And Wernicke's area is closer to the lower brain, and Broca's area is up near the prefrontal cortex of the brain. Those two areas actually solidify between the ages of 8 and 12 years old. And so using our senses kind of helps open up those areas. The other thing about it, though, is that if we learn languages, multiple languages from an earlier age, we are more likely to keep those areas more open and receptive to learning new language skills. And people who learn languages use more of their brains than those who do not, which I'm sure you know as language teachers yourselves. We experience language with all five of our senses. It is the essence of the human experience. So this idea that we can play a game on an app for 10 minutes a day and become fluent in a language is preposterous to me. We can't do that. It doesn't work, because we need to use our senses and we need to have human interaction. Language is experiences. Language is connection. It is how we connect to other human beings. And so we need to have that cultural piece. We need to have that humanistic piece. We cannot take the human out of language. We just can't. There is no way we can acquire language without the human piece. So language with the five senses is performance-based. That means we don't ever test our students. No, we don't give them speaking tests. We don't give them a test at all. In fact, we ask them to apply their language through projects, through simulation, through real life experiences. Think about it. Think about anxiety. Testing causes anxiety. Students who are required to test in a language, especially have a speaking test, they can create a mental block because of that. Because of anxiety, the amygdala will not let that information into the brain. And in fact, because of that anxiety, they may do really well on their speaking test, but then they may forget right after. It's whole language and comprehensible. That means we use whole language. When teaching vocabulary, we scaffold it, we put it with chunks of language so that students have pieces of language that they can draw from right away. It's culturally responsive and globally focused. That means we teach in the context of the world, and we're not just teaching language, we are teaching students how to be good citizens, how to give back to their communities. We are representing every student in our classes, in our curriculum, and we are validating those students. And it's student-centered. The student comes first. The learner comes first. We don't test them. We involve them in their learning. We give them rubrics. We discuss our expectations. We involve them. We make sure that they have ownership and buy-in of their learning. The goal is we want them to come out of our courses from the language with the five senses method And we want them to have a love of language, a love of culture, and a love of learning. And we want them to keep going. So yes, you can teach without translation. We are a zero translation method. And I cannot show this video for some reason. It won't let me, but I'm just going to explain it. If you've ever seen Google Translate songs, it gives us kind of an idea of why translation doesn't work. First of all, I have heard many people on the experts on the comprehensible input stage say that it is better to translate or to say the word and write it. But here's what I know about the brain. Remember when I told you the reticular activating system is there to make sure that the brain uses as few resources as necessary? Well, here's the deal. Your brain will default to whatever is familiar, to whatever is easier. So if you're saying a word in the target language and you're writing the word, the student will not hear the word that you've said. The student will only see the written word in their native language. It's the way that the brain uses fewer resources and fatigues itself less. So what you have to do is make the brain work. Yes, it will give them immediate understanding, but it won't stick up here because the reticular activating system will reject it. So we use images in language with the five senses. We use gestures in language with the five senses. We make sure that students can use all of their senses in order to get through the reticular activating system, through the amygdala, and into the upper part of the brain where they will retain the language skills in their long-term memory. We put it to a rhythm. There's lots of different ways that they can get the information without translation. Now, I know that this is a controversial idea, but through my research, the science does not support translation as a viable option for long-term retention and fluency.
Halsey, we all know that you are.
That's not good.
Halsey, we all know that you are an amazing singer.
That's an opinion.
Okay, well, hold on just a second. It's not, there we go. Okay, so translation doesn't work. It creates an extra step in the brain. If you have to think about what you're going to say, that does not promote fluency. Now, there is a place for translation if you're going to be a translator. You know, I have a friend in France who is a translator in English, Spanish, French, and Portuguese. Her native language is French, and the only language she can speak fluently is French. She cannot have a conversation in any of her translation languages, not a fluent one, because it's just a completely different skill in the brain. It can cause cultural blunders. It can cause miscommunication. You know, there's a lot of times where students will translate something and it means something completely different in the target language. The one I can think of that's in some places is becoming more acceptable, but still for me is kind of a shock, is je suis excitée. It's a different kind of excited than I'm so excited to go to France. We would say j'ai hâte in France instead. So that's one of those cultural blunders. The word préservatif does not mean the same as preservative, for example. So, you know, there are just some things that can cause cultural blunders. And it causes the language to stay in the short-term memory. Now, when I say no translation, it doesn't mean no L1. I use L1, for example, at the lower levels to talk about culture, to have deep discussions about cultural identity and global citizenship. You know, places where students, I want them to have a deeper understanding of something, we will use English. I will ask students to retell or interpret. That's different than translating. There is also times when I'll use it for word association. So for example, if I'm teaching the number cans, I will say cans of soup. So for pronunciation purposes, for transliteration, but I never say, for example, a cat is en chat. We always use images and gestures and rhythm, things like that. So we have this language process in the brain. It's a 4-step process. And whenever we're forming language, these are the steps. So first is conceptualization. This is what I want to say. Formulation is actually taking those thoughts of what you want to say and forming them into words. Articulation is saying the words, and then self-monitoring is, okay, is that what I meant to say? It's automatic, right? As I'm speaking to you right now, I'm going through all these steps as I'm speaking to you. It's automatic, it's coming out. When we teach language in the 5 senses way, when we eliminate translation, it makes those first 2 steps become automatic in the second language or the subsequent language. So while this is already an automatic in our native language, it helps it become automatic in our non-native languages that we speak. We don't have to think about and translate and then formulate. We just do it. It becomes automatic. So we all know what comprehensible input is, right? It's language input that can be understood by listeners despite them not understanding all the words and structures. And it uses contextual supports to help students understand. In language with the 5 senses, we call these clues for understanding. We teach students how to use cognates, words they already understand, and structures they already understand to understand things, and things like tone of voice, things like background noise, things like, you know, context. What do you see? What do you hear? What do you smell? You know, to interpret meaning. And honestly, in our own native languages, we only hear about 15 to 25% of the words that are being spoken to us. The rest of it is contextual understanding. And we will always understand in any language, even our native language, we will always understand more than we can say. That's just the nature of it. So let's define fluency. I like to say that fluency is not the same as accuracy. A lot of times people think fluency and accuracy are synonymous, but they are not. So we've got fluency is the speed and fluidity at which our brains can process and produce language. And then I define fluency further into 2 different categories. We have receptive fluency. How much can we understand and how quickly our brains can process receptive language or what is being said to us. And then we have expressive fluency. How rapidly our brains can process language and then produce language either spontaneously or in response to receptive language. So what has to come first? You know, a lot of times we learn language, our second language, or additional languages additional to our native language by trying to get students to read first or trying to get them to speak first, but we have to start with listening. So here is our process. Listening comes first. It takes about 300 hours of listening before a person from birth to age 8 can spontaneously produce language, and then it comes out slowly. Think about it. When we're born, we don't just come out speaking, right? We have to listen first. We listen for a year or more. We start babbling. We start repeating words. And then we start putting 2 words together and 3 words together and 4 words together. Now, think about the time our students in the United States, the average age is 15 years old. That's going to take up to 1,500 hours of listening before they can spontaneously produce language. They don't get 1,500 hours of language in 4 years of taking the language in high school, not even close. So we cannot expect them to be fluent in a language in 4 years, the way that they would be if they were completely immersed or they had learned it from birth. So we start with listening, 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 listening. The second part is we move our body. Think about it. When we're babies and toddlers, we learn through finger plays. We learn through stories. We learn through songs. So we put language to rhythm. We put it to pictures. And that's the next part, is I draw. Our brains are wired to naturally process ideas and language in images. So when we learn language, we draw it. And a lot of times when I'm teaching language, I'm drawing, I'm speaking, they're listening to me. The students are drawing at the same time. They're copying what I'm drawing. And they're hearing language at the same time, and it helps the brain process that language and send it up into the cerebral cortex, or the upper part of the brain. The next part is I play. We know that when you're having fun, you're more likely to learn. And so we play a lot of games. Then I create a project where I apply the language skills that I have learned, and I apply past language skills along with that. So I don't ever test, I create a project. I come to conclusions myself, I discover, and I learn through discovery and through application. And then the last part is I cook. And the reason why we use cooking is because it activates the sense of taste and smell. And food is a huge part of culture, right? So I have projects where students take home a recipe and they make it at home. We cook in school. We use a lot of food for smell, for taste. Cooking is huge, a huge part of this. So that is an explanation and an overview of language with the 5 senses. I would love to have you contact me if you have any questions, if you want ideas. I have a blog on the website, lots of ideas there for how language with the 5 senses works. Thank you so much for watching this today, and have a wonderful afternoon, a wonderful rest of your conference. Au revoir.